Welcome everybody to this last of our series in the African Knowledge Seminar Series, which is a collaboration between the Chair for Critical Studies in Higher Education and Transformation at Mandela, the Mengini Institute for Comparative Global Studies in Massachusetts, and the Center for Philosophy in Africa here at Mandela, as well as all the sort of normal partners, Faculty of Humanities and the DVC for Engagement and Transformation. I hope you're all doing well. The weather has become much better, but also become much worse here in Makhanda. We're dying of heat. But other than that, just blessed to be alive and happy. I'd like to welcome you today. The program is fairly straightforward. I will do the facilitation and I will invite my colleague, Karabo Mayane, to introduce our guest speaker. And then there will be this lecture given by our colleague, Professor Ajei, and then we will have time for questions. Yes, I'm not sure what much to say. I think we've had a really interesting run with the seminars, really trying to push ourselves to talk about Africa in a way that's going to help us to make sense of what we ought to do and what we are doing and really try to find the knowledge forms that are going to help us move forward and away from the orthodoxies of Western thought, including the orthodoxies of Western liberal thought. So with that, may I invite our colleague Karabo Mayane to please introduce our guest for today.
Thank you so much, Professor Nkize. Good afternoon, colleagues. My name is Karabo Mayane. I am a lecturer at the Department of Philosophy here in Nelson Mandela University. As a researcher, I'm interested in how various artificial intelligence technologies as introduced in society has the effect in terms of warfare, the future of health, and the future of work. I think the conversation today is timely in that it addresses issues of agency in terms of our development agenda, which is important, especially when it comes to AI technologies. My role today is very easy, which is to introduce our speaker. Professor Martin Odey Ajei is an associate professor of philosophy in the Department of Philosophy and Classics at the University of Ghana. He obtained his D.Litt. FPhil in philosophy from the University of South Africa, an MPhil from the University of Ghana, and a BA honors from the University of Stockholm in Sweden. His academic research focuses on the interests include African philosophy, applied ethics, political philosophy, and the philosophies of liberation. For the past decade, these interests have narrowed to elaborating a Ghanaian tradition of philosophy and to bringing African and Western normative theories into intellectual contact with each other in order to counteract the parochial theorizing in Western and political thinking. Prof. Ajei's objective in joining African and Western normative theorizing are twofold. First, to uncover flaws in the presumption of liberal universalism and in the marginalization of African intellectual perspectives. And second, to enrich global theorizing through inclusion of African intellectual perspectives. In the latter task, he has persistently engaged with the proclamations of the universal validity of global normative theorizing that recur in Western normative political thinking. Prof. Ajei works to call attention to the fact that the language of the theorists' philosophical analysis is exclusively liberal and that the relevant side of their debate are predominantly Western. Further, he argues for the balance in the historically inherited image of African backwardness that informs such debate. He is an author of over 20 peer-reviewed journal articles and book chapters, and 2 books, namely The Paranormal, which is an inquiry into the Akan metaphysics and epistemology, and Africa's Development, the Imperatives on Indigenous Knowledge and Values. He is also an editor of an anthology of philosophical commentary on Kwame Nkrumah's philosophy, Disentangling Conscientism, Essays on Kwame Nkrumah's philosophy. He's currently a fellow in German Reference Center for Ethics in life sciences at the University of Bern and preparing his third book, Empathetic Humanism, a Legon Tradition of African Philosophy. Dear colleagues, please allow me and help me welcome Professor Ajei.
Well, thank you very much. And I thank you all for attending this talk. And let me begin by thanking Professor Gyekye for inviting me to give this talk and to have the conversation with you. And let me begin right away by stating the proposal which I intend to defend, which is that an ethic of communalism derived from African concepts of personhood is a viable foundation for conceptualizing Africa's development. Now, by a viable foundation, I do not mean that it's a sufficient condition. The claim is more modest. It's simply that such an ethic is a necessary condition for our development to the extent that it offers principles and values and lessons that can properly guide progress-oriented policies on the continent. Now, discussions of Africa's development have been a protracted debate of it, and this probably may underlie the reason why Paul Zelezer suggests that scholars of social progress in Africa should spend less time offering more prescriptions of the theoretical and strategic directions that Africa should take, because according to him, we've received, to quote, an overabundance of such prescriptions, and that in spite of this overabundance, we are no better for it. Now, I want to disagree with Zelezer right from the outset. But before I go on to offer my reasons why I disagree with him, let me state briefly what I mean by the terms development and of modernity in the title of my talk. Although Kant has cautioned us against definitions at the onset of our philosophical discussions, I think it might be a good idea to begin with these. By development, I simply see, or in development, I see a normative tool that serves a desirable end, as it were. It is a normative tool. The conceptions and the strategies of development for me are nothing but tools towards an end. And this end is a society's ability to meet its existential needs adequately and to preserve and to improve human life and human dignity and human welfare. These strategies are just means to enhance the continual achievement of this end. So what about modernity? Let me try and define modernity as I would work with in this talk negatively. I don't think that the modernity that we should be in quest of is the modernism of the 19th and 20th century Europe, which essentially reflected the emerging industrial world and thought of traditional knowledge and values as obsolete. I would not also mean by modernity, modernization theory, but I'll come to that a bit later. So for me, modernism involves what Uridu cautions us against. According to Uridu, that to pursue modernism, we should discard three mischiefs of progressive social organization. One is anachronism, which he defines as thoughts and practices that have outlasted their suitability. Two, authoritarianism, which is basically for him, the overriding of unjustified overriding of the wills of individuals. And three, supernaturalism, which for him means the seeking of solutions in supernatural sources. What I would want to do is simply to expand Uridu's idea of supernaturalism a bit, and rather than supernaturalism writ large, say that the pursuit of modernity involves discarding of unfettered supernaturalism, which for me would mean the seeking of solutions to social problems, predominantly in a supernatural north. So I see that Uridu's, or I think that Uridu's prescription for modernity is distinguishable from modernism, as I have just briefly described. And it's also distinguishable from the key assumptions of modernization theory, which we would see shortly has dominated development thinking and imagination since the 1970s, and which I would argue is even currently in African public policy on development in the AU's Agenda 2063 is strongly represented. If we accept Uridu's idea of modernity, we see that it is integral to the quest of development, as I have just defined, because Uridu's prescriptions essentially pay heed to the transformative potential of African intellectual resources. And it also is essentially humanistic, and for me, therefore, bodes well for the achievement of human dignity and welfare. If this is development, and if development and modernity involves these, then for me, a good vision of development would likewise imply the importance of contextual knowledge in its formulation, and also in the outlining of the strategies for its application. Now, this provides us with two reasons why we should disagree with Zeleza, because, and these reasons would both be empirical and conceptual. Conceptually, if the context is important, then we should admit that the contexts are dynamic, and so they should require continuous review. We cannot at any time claim adequacy or the saturation of development visions. We cannot come to an end of history, you see. For if there is any such state as the end of history, we would not in fact be there to account for it. Now, empirically too, the wealth of ideas on Africa's development since the World War II, in fact, has fallen very short of the expectations of their intended beneficiaries. The palpable poverty and the endless struggle to meet our existential needs on the continent, I think, is adequate empirical evidence of this. Hence, it does not appear to me that we can, as Zeleza think, consider us to have a good enough stock of visions of development, and so therefore we should just get into plans and procedures for operationalizing these. Now, Why have these development visions and strategies failed on the continent? I think they have failed primarily because of the stranglehold of non-African paradigms since the beginning of our independence, and the disregard of the principles and the norms of our social organizational principles, particularly the communalist ethics that have formed our historical organization of societies. And so these failures, up until 1994, were very stark, and they continue to be. And in 1994, Goran Haydn, he came out to say that African scholarship has just tended to echo in an opportunistic fashion the voices of theories elsewhere. And he thinks this is one of the reasons why we're unable to make progress in our development aspirations. Well, I think that this echoing of non-Western conceptions of progress continue in African scholarship and in African policy. And a brief look at the history of development practice on our continent will bear this claim out. Right from the onset of their emergence, the Bretton Woods institutions have largely driven the goals and the strategies of development in Africa. This has been sufficiently theorized, by both Africans and non-Africans, so there's no need to go into the details of that. But we must remember that the functions of these institutions were and continue to be predicated on the liberalization of trade. So their visions of development for Africa have steadfastly promoted economic progress and idealized forms of the achievements of Western society. And I've indicated elsewhere in the book that our colleague mentioned that it is not unreasonable, actually, to suppose that from their genesis up to date, these Bretton Woods institutions have remained very apathetic, decidedly apathetic, to a favorable imagination of Africa's development. So why so? Well, it is because I think the theoretical basis of the models that they have promoted stem from modernization theory, which, as I have said, should not be a model of modernity for us. Modernization theory has construed the third world, of course, including African countries, as backward, and prescribed as a solution to this backwardness a process of evolution that is modeled on the development paths of what it considered to be the developed world, which is North America and West and European countries. Now, modernization's prescriptions stemmed from three theoretical heritages: one, evolutionary theory; two, functionalism; and classical economic theory. So Rostow's theory of economic growth, for instance, which represents an apogee of modernization theory, seeks to demonstrate basically that modernization is a linear process. It's a phased and linear process towards economic development, nothing else. And that given this phased process, there must be a kind of homogeneity that is assumed. And this tendency towards homogeneity can be found in Talcott Parsons' functionalist theory, particularly in his claim that the patterns of modernization are such that more highly developed and modernized societies become and more they resemble each other. So the upshot of the assumptions of modernization, I'm saying, which are the assumptions that have been adopted wholesale, I think, by these Bretton Woods institutions, is that liberal economic and democratic stability that typifies Western societies are universally valuable models of modernity that Africa should emulate. Note that in this whole idea of modernity, African knowledge and African values and the lessons from African history play no role whatsoever. And in fact, in the vision of development by modernization, one can find an implication that the cherished values of our indigenous cultures are eliminable, as it were, on the path towards development. The landscape of our development visions is replete with policy goals that pay allegiance to these assumptions of modernization. Witness the structural adjustment policies that were imposed in the 1980s as conditions for concessionary loans to almost the whole of sub-Saharan Africa by the World Bank and the IMF. And also the poverty reduction strategies that followed the SAPs in the 1980s and 1990s. These essentially told us that there is a universal structure of development which these countries in Africa and elsewhere must adjust in order to have any possibility whatsoever of development. Nothing at all about the context, nothing about lessons from history, nothing about the values that animate a people's desire to live and to progress. But they failed. As I have indicated, there is enough empirical evidence there. And why have they failed? They have failed because, let me repeat, the progressive values and the principles of the context of their application were ignored completely in their conceptualization. So at the dawn of the 1990s, again, we heard of a paradigmatic crisis in Africa's development, and social scientists proceeded to commit to the quest for new paradigms. The hope, of course, was that we would be able to strike some homegrown models that would correct this balance of externally derived models and goals of development. Let me quickly, still on this historical path, just discuss 4 of them, and to substantiate the point that I want to make before I go on to look at possibilities, and that these models still continue to promote the visions of modernization. These 4 models that I want to talk about are the Millennium Development Goals and the Strategic Development Goals that were formulated outside of Africa, and also on the continent, the NEPAD and the current development paradigm for Africa, Agenda 2063. I want to point out that all these 4 models have failed to wean themselves from the orientations of modernization theory. That's my thesis. Why? Because although the Millennium Development Goals and the Strategic Development Goals have been driven by the UN systems rather than by the Bretton Woods institutions, they still exhibit no difference in kind from the assumptions of the SAPs and the poverty reduction strategies. The MDGs and the SDGs, like the SAPs and the PRSPs, adopt a one-size-fits-all approach to development that displaces Africa's cultural knowledge and values. And this is precisely the basic tenets of modernization theory. For instance, the MDGs established universally agreed goals, quote and unquote, universally agreed objectives for tackling human needs. The SDGs likewise adopt this structuralist, universalist approach. And as with the SAPs and the poverty reduction strategy papers, it is arguable that a representation of African thought in formulating these two strategies or models is very negligible at best. What about the African models? Or rather, let me just go a little more on the strategic development goals, because one may disagree and say that, but the UN had a working group that drafted the goals, and that there was African representation on this working group. And also that there was African representation in the adoption of these strategies in 2015 at UN headquarters. Well, I say that such African representation was merely formal and cannot be taken to translate into the inclusion of substantive African content, values, and perceptions of progress in these goals. But more worrisome is the negligible representation of substantive African values in NEPAD and in Agenda 2063. Let us remember, as I just said right at the onset of my talk, that for me, development is nothing. The conceptions of development are just normative guides to policy towards a desirable end. That such strategies and visions merely endeavor to map the means to a continual enhancement of a society's ability to preserve and to improve upon human life and dignity and welfare. Hence, the context, the principles and values of the context are pivotal, as are historical lessons. Now, from these premises, I say that both NEPAD and Agenda 2063 have not fared sufficiently well in representing African thought. So far from fulfilling its self-definition as an African-owned and African-led development program, NEPAD merely affirms, the modernization theoretical assumptions by what? By trivializing the role that African culture should play in the continent's development. To put the matter in a nutshell, NEPAD acknowledges, let me quote, Africa's rich cultural legacy, but it merely assigns to this legacy the role of, quoting again, consolidating the pride of Africans in their own humanity. And I think that a rich cultural legacy is capable of achieving far more than this in a homegrown continental framework for development. Likewise, Agenda 2063. It professes to be a blueprint and a master plan for transforming our continent for the next 50 years. Now, two things are worthy of note about how problematic this agenda is in light of our premise about the importance of the context. One, the agenda has 7 aspirations. It has outlined 7 aspirations. Each of these aspirations has goals which, if achieved, would move Africa closer to the vision of the agenda. But of these 7 aspirations, only one, that is aspiration 5, mentions Africa's cultural heritage and values. And even in this solitary mentioning of African cultural values, Agenda 2063, the formulators think that this goal of aspiration 5 is to ensure that the creative arts are the major contributors to African growth and transformation. And 2, that the creative arts should serve to restore and preserve Africa's cultural heritage. This is the only role that Africa's cultural heritage has been assigned in Agenda 2063. Secondly, it also, so apart from the aspirations, it has these flagship programs. There are 15 of them, which are effortlessly aligned with the 17 strategic development goals. And of these 15 flagship programs, only one pronounces on Africa's capacity, or the capacity of African values to mobilize energies toward achieving the goals of the agenda. And even just this one mention says that African cultural values should just gear towards establishing a museum to create awareness about our dynamic and vast cultural artifacts. Now, with all due respect to creative artists and to the historians of art, it is for me very difficult to fathom that a museum of artifacts and the productions of the creative arts should suffice as the predominant representatives of Africa's intellectual heritage and as the preeminent guides in a homegrown vision of sustainable transformation. So I think that although NEPAD and Agenda 2063 offer some theoretical contributions that differ in degree from modernization-inspired paradigms, that these theoretical perspectives do not differ in kind from these non-African models that have conditioned our development aspirations for the past 70 years or longer. So even though these 2 African models claim to be homegrown, I would say that they are hardly nourished by the African intellectual soil. Now, why is contextualization so important? Why does contextualization matter for formulating a vision of one's future? And why is its disregard morally wrong? Because I think that the disregard of African cultural knowledge in formulating our future is immoral. Well, the consequentialist vision of development that I have outlined, I think, requires input from the objects of the ends of those paradigms. I've offered a practical reason, an empirically based reason why excluding such contextual knowledge is wrong. And it's because, as I said, it leads to failures of the models. Now, let me offer a theoretical reason for why it is wrong. It is immoral, like I have said, not to pay heed to our intellectual products. A people must be able to make sense of their conceptions of sustainable progress, or of the conceptions of progress, of their progress that are sustainable. A people must be able to determine, they must be able to determine what they value in a life that is worth living. I think the intended beneficiaries of the development if we see them as objects of moral value, then they must be offered the opportunity to make sense of the visions that have been devised of their own progress at the very time of the formulation of these visions. I have said that they must be able to make sense, and I use the notion of sense making in a technical sense of the term as it has been evolved by Carl Wise, who is a specialist in organizational development. According to Wise, sense-making supplies a negotiated and shared normative perspective by rational agents, which underlies the creative transformation of the social norms and structures that they share. So sense-making is a deliberative mechanism that can transform the objects of the concepts of development into subjects, into agents, because they must be involved in the deliberation of the ends and of the reasons and of the pathways to the achievement of these ends. But one cannot properly make sense of development goals when the ideas about the good and the beautiful and the desirable and the truthful in the cultural context are completely muted in deliberations on why certain goals are preferable and how those preferred goals should be approached. So Africa, with its long history of social organization, definitely must have something to contribute to notions of progress, to notions of its own progress, and de-emphasizing this capability, de-emphasizing Africa's sense-making in its development aspirations, I think is morally wrong. It is morally wrong. When I say it's morally wrong, I mean simply that it offends our beliefs about what is right and what is wrong, that it offends the principles of justice and of fairness, that it displays it displays bad character and bad intentions, if you like. So I think the pathways to an envisioning of a future of development that to a future of development that resonates with who we are and with where we have chosen to go, ought to take this idea of sense-making very seriously. How practically can this be done? What is to be done? What is to be done to rectify the mistakes of the past? Well, at least for one, we should keep on philosophizing. We should keep on philosophizing and we should keep on defying the laser by bringing to light deficiencies as we go along in the statu quo and in the aberrations in history, and to continue to make proposals for rectifying these aberrations, as it were. If we think this is a good way to go, then one practical thing that I would propose is that the NEPAD Secretariat, which is currently responsible for overseeing the implementation of Agenda 2063, should have an ethics desk or an ethics team that will be charged with sieving out principles and norms in our cultural context that can be brought to bear on formulating a cogent framework to aid the interpretation and the implementation of the flagship programs of Agenda 2063. I am not so sure that we can say now that we should discard the agenda and to begin to reformulate and take these cultural products into consideration. But at least in the interpretations of the various goals, we can bring our knowledge and our visions to bear. Now, this necessarily would mean that such an ethics desk or an ethics team or an ethics committee or whatever it is must grapple with certain things. And I would think that some of the issues that they ought to consider are how African notions of personhood, particularly the African view of a human being as intrinsically inseparable from community, how such a notion of personhood can be harnessed to formulate strategies for the flagship programs. If a person is part of an ordered whole, and the principle of order of this whole is the ethic of community, then how may this ethic of community and the mutual interdependence that is the mutual interdependence that exemplify the structure of this whole, how can this inform the interpretation of the aspirations of the agenda and the flagship programs of the agenda? How would solidarity and cooperation and reciprocal responsibility be plowed as necessary requirements for pursuing infrastructural projects and for the pursuit of material wealth for a dignified life? How would the relationship between the citizens and the state look like, where it's structured on this ontology of personhood and the ethics, the communalist ethics that emerges from it? How would such a relationship come to play? Would it necessarily require that we need to amend our constitutions, for instance, to insert a bill of duties that elaborate these foundational obligations of community, that elaborate the obligations of the state in relation to its citizens in a manner that accords with this idea of what persons are in our cultures? Would such a constitution amendment hasten the process towards achieving the goal, as Agenda 2063 says, the goal of the Africa we would want? How would it look like? I have no more questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Prof. Those are the questions. I open it up to colleagues who wish to make comments or reflections. You can do so by putting up your hand. Otherwise, I think, let me invite a reflection. I see Okeja, I see you. I just wanted to ask you, Prof, you've posed questions. I know that's the tendency of philosophers. I'm reminded of my colleague's work, Umakukwan, who is looking at the role of the grandmother as an institution in an African household, building on the work of the West African feminists and so on. And in her work, she's saying, when we start to see the grandmother through the African values, you see the grandmother as not simply an object of welfare in the modern state. And you can see the grandmother as being not simply just a vulnerable aged, but you can see the grandmother as an institution, as part of the seniority of the African household, the matriarchal anchoring of an African household, the lineages of an African household, and basically almost the base of learning in an African household is a grandmother. And that's almost universal in many cultures. I'm not sure how many suburban elite Westerners still see the grandmother like that. The trouble we have is, how do we translate the understanding of the grandmother as an institution into our policy languages and frameworks? So we all have that experience, but the grandmother is a vulnerable person in the SDGs, right? She's the African woman whose back is broken, that needs a water well built for her. How do we as Africans really go beyond that? So she does need the well, she does need to be taken care of, she does need policy that will bring water to her, or that will take care of those things, but not as an object of pity, but she's a senior in the community. in what ways can we bring those two things together? Then I'll, okay, that's my question. Let me invite Gyekye first.
Okay, yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for the very nice presentation, Martin. I don't know if what I have is a question or just a bit of reflection on your presentation, but you will decide how to respond. You see, I'm sure you are familiar with we've discussed it from time to time, the work of Claude Gyekye, the Nigerian social theorist. So he made this very interesting comment in one of his works that development was never on the agenda of the post-colonial African state. And that in the post-colonial context, in Africa especially, there is a high premium that is placed on, the acquisition of power. Mm-hmm. And so development only begins to matter within the post-colonial African context, especially for the political elite, when in the contestation for power, it becomes expedient to co-opt the language of development. Mm-hmm. So now, I also agree that what we need to do is to begin with the reconstitution of the parameters of agency, in our context, and this necessarily leads back to the question of how it is we can do justice to the African cultural heritage. But the challenge remains that the context in which all these things are supposed to happen is broken. The state seems to not be a solution, but rather the problem. The dreams of many young people in Africa today is they are unable to realize their dreams precisely because of the state. The state damages their dream, makes it impossible for them to realize their dreams. That is one. The other thing is, if we are going to, like you are suggesting, build on the indigenous, on the African cultural heritage, immediately the experience of modernization, so-called, in Africa would lead us to ask the question, which culture? Which African culture? Because the state, the way it has manifested in the African context, has actually somehow reified things that were not problems, at least not to this proportion, which is ethnic differences. So now people genuinely ask, if we are unable at this point to use the instrument of the state to create some kind of social cohesion in African societies, how then are we going to be able to build on African culture as a way to, make the idea of development to work for us? So these are difficult, intractable problems, so to speak. But I just, thought that, it will be interesting to question further whether the problem is to look at the possibility of reconstituting the sense of agency that we can attribute to the state as an agent of development in Africa, or whether we have to begin to think about how it is we can transcend the state, because the state has committed more crime against the people in Africa than most of the other agents operating in Africa. The state kills, the state thwarts the project of development driven by private sector and even private individuals. So I don't then know how it is possible for us to begin to think about the possibility of reconstituting the agency of the state vis-a-vis the project of development. But otherwise, a very interesting talk. Thank you.
Thanks. I just wanted to quickly acknowledge the Deputy Vice Chancellor for Engagement and Transformation, Professor Andre Kiet, hi Prof. Kiet, as well as the Deputy Dean for the Faculty of Humanities, Prof. Gyekye Lick, who are both in attendance at the seminar. Over to you, Prof, and then we'll move to the next set of questions in the chat.
Yeah, thank you very much. And Uchenna, but let me just begin with Nomalanga's grandmother as the repository of knowledge. I mean, so my proposal, what I'm thinking is, yes, we have to envision reimagine what the notion of vulnerability is. By looking at our own social structures and determining whether the categories of people that our modern structures of governance consider to be vulnerable are. For instance, let me give, we still are in this pandemic, and the distribution of vaccines, you would know that, I don't know how it is in South Africa, but here in Ghana, so we have these categories of the people who should have access immediately or by priority, and the reasons for why. And yes, you know how it went, the health, frontline workers and all of that, and then next the old and the vulnerable. And why the vulnerable? Well, because they are old. And why? Yeah, they are old, and so, we should, it's just a matter of being kind to them. The young are stronger, can withstand the vagaries of an infection more than the old. And since we are all citizens, we should take care of those who are physiologically vulnerable to the possible attack by this virus. And then, so this was the discussion in Ghana too. And then someone said, but that is not, it's not, we should not attend to old people here because they are vulnerable. But the reason, the ethical, the moral reason for that should be that they are repositories of knowledge. When an old person dies in a village, this thing is transmitted orally, and depends on who is there, who has acquired the wisdom that she has, you may lose a lot. The symbols of the presence of our societies and repositories of knowledge. And this is a better reason why we must preserve their lives. Now, it's a qualitatively different reason, but probably it's the same thing. But, to see a person as, well, I'm doing you a favor, by keeping you alive for a bit longer, and I need you. So I want you to stay alive. Two completely different ways of thinking about society. So I think it's just a matter of orientation, I think, of our thinking, right? Perhaps we'll be seeking the same ends, but the reasons for seeking those ends are important. Now, Uchenna, you are absolutely right. Look, man, it's a mess. And it's a mess that began right at the onset of the transition of power. I agree. We all know what happened there. I mean, conceptions of statehood. Gyekye has theorized this thing beautifully. We've had several discussions on this, you and I. And the fact that the constitutional arrangements that were imposed in order to exit very quickly and to perpetuate the structures that had been created, was what it was has brought us a lot. In fact, you can say that is one of the fundamental bases of social organization in Africa, of finding a balance of public morality that can be useful to our development. Even Nussbaum has stated this, that look, one of the problems here is the structure of statehood itself is contractualist. I mean, the whole idea of a social contract, is that something really that we can say is compatible with the vision of social structuring in Africa? No. Before the imposition of this idea of the rights of the state and the rights of the individual is considered as having born into a community, and so is a pre-contractualist arrangement. The idea of the social contract and of contractualist notions on which our state apparatuses are built, you can say from the African point of view is nonsensical, right? And it is the tension between the facts of our historical evolution and the impositions that have created these problems. I agree. So what am I saying? Yes, it's problematic, but I think what I'm saying is that for me, I'm a philosopher who is interested in ethics, and all I can say really is let us reimagine, and perhaps at some point we can convince the constitutional lawyers to come in to tell us how in law it can be done. And hopefully we can have some politicians who are sensible enough to think that this is worth doing, right? So it is not impossible. You reduce paper on the state and society. I mean, the idea of there being a symmetry between the state and civil society is not impossible. I mean, we've done that for hundreds of years. Can we recover? Can we adapt? Can we reimagine? I think we can. How? We just have to philosophize, and that's it.
I think there is a how, Prof. I think there's a how in the education institutions we have. It's in the type of Black child we produce. And I think we may be underestimating the need to produce a particular type of Black child through that philosophy. So Karabo here says, can we achieve any of these aspirations? Just take notes, Prof. This is on the chat. Can we achieve any of these aspirations, especially that of agency, if we are still under austerity from Bretton Woods institutions? And is modernity a necessary condition for development? Okay, so that's Karabo. Isaiah Nigedu. As you rightly said that modernity is defined within the framework of the West. You also said we need to define our own modernity outside the Western frame of reference. By this, I presume you speak of an alternative modernity, but an alternative modernity is still modernity. Is there a possibility of an alternative to modernity? And then I will allow Dr. Nzioki to pose a question.
No, thank you. Mine is a quick one, and I think I'll sort of echo what Professor Mkize has just said, and also sort of challenge you on the question of just philosophizing as the only thing we have. I mean, surely at some point we need to be able to do something. And I think that's a discussion we had, because if I take what you've just said and I rephrase it, I don't know if the laser is off the mark completely when he says we have a lot of resources. And I don't know if he's saying that we need to stop now. I think what the laser is saying is we need to do something ultimately because we've got a lot of resources, as you have pointed, Uchenna has pointed, and as you know, Ake points. And one of the things I'm trying to bring to the center is what Professor Mkize is pointing out, the kind of attributes, and you've said that, the kind of orientation to thinking. So probably someone will say the disposition to think Africa again differently as an activity we are supposed to be doing. Surely that we can't just leave to philosophize it. At some point, something needs to start happening. And we know we can do that. And it will not be a panacea to answer everything. It will be a scaffold. We begin building incrementally. And I'm saying that I think the laser has something because if you imagine what Nyerere did with Ujamaa, Ujamaa as a political proposition failed in terms of, if we were to think of it as a whatever for governance, it failed, a program of action. But the spirit of it aligns with Ubuntu, personhood. In fact, the definition of personhood, as the late Ifeanyi Menkiti put it, is captured in what Nyerere said even then already, that if you think of yourself as different from your family and you begin to take from the cookie jar, it means then you are already telling the others they are going to be your servants. That's number one. Then there's other ideas like what Mazrui said, the African, just like all other human beings, already has the disposition, has the feeling, or they've got the attribute that tells them that I can govern myself. And that's why they fought for freedom to begin with. So I believe we already have this, and that's what Zeleza is saying, I believe. A lot has been written, all these resources, very good ones, traditional, others that we can even repurpose from other places. But I believe we need to start somewhere. And one of the things that I can propose is what Ake says is a problem with Africa, the political question. We continue producing messiahs. So we have younger, kids coming into the political space, and what they see is their political messiahs who do not have any interest in the big program. So how do we do with these young people? Because I believe we can, not to look at messiahs and we move away from politics of messiahs who lead people to death, and we elect the same people, and then the young people who come in, they come take the same dispositions, the same orientations to thinking. We'll then continue speaking about development or failures of it if we do not think that we've produced a bad political sensibility, and we can arrest that with the kind of mindsets we create. So in that way, yes, we've got resources, and yes, Zeleza is saying, let's stop now looking for more. We can already start with what we have, but we need to look at the kind of mindsets that we create, the kinds of dispositions we try to introduce or cultivate with the kind of training, including philosophical training. Thanks.
Right. Yes, I mean, I think you're right. And if my criticism of Zeleza was too stringent, what I sought to say basically is that as a philosopher, I find it difficult to accept the prescription that there is enough of theoretical perspective on the directions of progress for the continent. And so we should stop and now begin applying, because for me, I think the context is ever changing, is ever dynamic, and it will therefore necessarily require constant attention to theorizing the modifications that occur. Secondly, is that I'm a philosophy teacher, and I do not have any political aspirations. And what I think I can do is to offer my perspectives and to encourage others to try to see if there is any virtue in them. And for instance, in this talk, if let's do something is, I am saying that, look, the AU should try to restructure. And the AU should understand that the path of development that is taking, at least theoretically, is problematic. And that the AU should, we should look at finding a structure that can try to balance these things. Perhaps that can be seen as trying to do something. If I were the president of Ghana, I think I would do more. If I were a parliamentarian, I think I probably might be able to do more. So that is the context for me, the limitations for me as a philosophy teacher that I think I have in terms of, yeah, the philosophers have theorized enough. Now is the time for them to do something, yeah? Now, but I agree with you that, look, there is a lot to be done. One can begin even with just the very idea of the democracy that we have adopted and think that it is universally viable. Really has written, I mean, there's been discussions of this since the 80s. Why has no one paid any heed? I don't know. I don't know. So yes, I think for me, what one can do is to philosophize and to try to seek to get attention to the proposals that one has, to bring it into the purview of discussion in the very limited context that one is, to try and do something, set up an ethics lab in the department at the University of Ghana. These are the kind of things that I personally see that I can do.
Thank you. Can I invite Faisal Garba to make a comment?
Yeah,
Thank
thank you very much, Professor Gyekye, and thanks to Professor Ajei. If the chair allows me to just make this kind of rider. Professor Ajei was my lecturer, I think 10 years ago at the philosophy department in Lagos. But I kind of
can you switch on your video and let me see your face?
My camera has a problem.
In case you actually turn out to be a phantom.
My camera has a problem.
Okay, Faisal. Yes.
But I kind of ran away from philosophy, and I'm in a sociology department now. So
good for you. Good for you. Running away.
My point relates to that in a sense. I really like the point about the relationship between the state and society, the kind of ethics that governs that. In particular, if one thinks of this question around mandatory vaccine, we're having a debate here in my university here, a huge debate whether everybody should be mandatorily vaccinated, and polarizing positions. But I think there's something about the character of authority, of power, that lends itself to the way in which people perceive this vaccine, this mistrust for the state, and this idea that this thing is an imposition. Not to talk about the kind of blatant racism. Think of the recent so-called simplified directive from the UK government that says if you're vaccinated from certain countries, you are not considered to be unvaccinated. But I want to come now to the point of power relations. So I get the point that we need to ground a certain ethic rooted in African culture. I'll come to that later. But you see, our societies are very differentiated, and they've always been. So my question is, how do we deal with the question of differentiation? Because culture in itself, you see, is not flat. One version of culture could be linked to power groups, elites, and you might have a subaltern interpretation of the same culture. Yeah. And so how do we deal with this question? And I want to come to, related to that, I want to come to Uchena's point, and you made the point earlier about the post-colonial legacy, right? But I also think that if we historicize a bit, the immediate post-colonial period had some promise, and it's not because of the vision of the elites, I contend. It's really about the mobilization of ordinary people, right? C.L.R. James has this book called Nkrumah and the Ghanaian Revolution, where he was talking about every corner you pass in Accra, you meet market women, so-called street people, discussing serious political ideas about the direction of society, okay? And I think it was that pressure that pushed African states to implement certain progressive ideas, right? Reduce them to policy. And of course, all this was reversed in the structural adjustment project, beginning with the whole knowledge project that Africa doesn't need education. What we need is basic education. So what I want to foreground here is the real need for political economy, right? In how we think about these things and history. And secondly, to problematize this idea of African culture or the Black person, because really, our identities are very much rooted, in terms of where we find ourselves, our social location, right? The way we make a living, where we are located in the ordinal ranking of people. So that the idea of Africanity really would vary depending on whether one is a chief in some gold producing area or you are a migrant worker working in a mine somewhere. Thank you very much.
There's just one other question, Prof, from Wonga Tabata. This will be the last question. How do we address the Anglo-French divide in our continent, especially within the AU? These divisions serve as a barrier to the current debates that call for a new mindset, and they encourage neo-imperialism and Western domination.
Could you repeat that question? I didn't really get that well.
Yes, it's there in the chat. It says, how do we address the Anglo-French divide? That eternal question, especially within the AU. These divisions serve as a barrier to current debates that call for a new mindset and encourage neo-imperialism and Western domination. So I guess this is talking about the ways in which these African multilateral institutions just seem to mirror division in and of themselves.
All right. So Faisal, you are right. There's a lot of disparity in our cultures and, the, conceptual rootedness that sometimes are difficult to overcome but on the other hand, you must also admit that there is enough that we share in common. I mean, in terms of values and perceptions and ideas about, about life and possibilities. Across the continent, there are. I mean, there is enough said about this thing that there are commonalities. So even across the continent, there are, and within countries. So you are Ghanaian. Also, let me just give you an example of the basis of my optimism that convergence is something that we must consider possible and pursuable. A study was done intentionally across cultures, one in the Ashanti region, one in the Volta region, and one in the north, right? The Dagombas, the Ewes, and the Akans, represented by the Ashantis. And the question was, I think it was a year ago, March of last year, 16 months ago, would you cede some of what you consider to be your rights for the purpose of securing public safety? Yes, 60%. I think the lowest was 62%. The average was 67%, right? So these are three, as you know, Faisal, very different, very different, I don't know, but distinct cultures within the country. But they all had a perception of what the public good is and what the place of the individual in negotiating the public good. So I believe that with enough, I mean, we must be optimistic about the possibilities of reaching these convergences, because it is one of the most potent resources that we have to be able to motivate us to seek change and to succeed, persistently enough to succeed at having some change anyway. So I do not look too much, or I do not consider the differences to be stifling enough to not provide the motivation for action, right? Action in a sense of putting the ideas out there and trying to get people on board to to coalesce around those ideas. The last question I don't understand very much, but there was, I think prior to that, somebody asked about my distinction between modernization and modernism and modernity, as I think we in Africa should a working definition of modernity. And I invoked the perspectives of Kwesi Wiredu, who theorized this in the 1980s about what should be avoided in the quest for modernity. And I simply said that I agree with him that, I mean, it's not as if it's a sufficient condition for achieving the modernity, but that these are necessary elements and that we should avoid anachronism and authoritarianism and, you know, unfettered supernaturalism. And I think that this is a good enough, it's good enough beginning, as it were.
Thank you, Prof, for this sort of rigorous engagement. I just want to invite Karabo to make just one final comment reflecting on your input.
Thank you very much, Professor Gyekye. Thank you so much, Prof, for a very engaging talk. I think one of the key takeaways is that it is important for us to own our epistemologies, and I agree with that 100%. And I think perhaps in us owning our own epistemologies, we should also consider how to philosophize around the question of austerity, because part of us not owning our epistemologies is based on the fact that our economic policies are held at ransom by the fact that we owe these Bretton Woods organizations. So those of us who philosophize, perhaps it's our responsibility to either come up with frameworks of repaying debt or measures of canceling it, because it is through that, I believe, that we can then have conversations about, now that we are outside of the hands of those that we owe, how can we then implement how we define ourselves? Thank you, Professor Mkhize. Thank you, Professor Ajei, for a fantastic talk.
Oh, we need to have that conversation. How do we own our epistemologies while we're busy owing someone else the debt for our development? Fantastic way to put it, Karabo. Okay, so Prof, that's the question for the next round of these seminars next year. Can I invite Dr. Gyekye to just say thank yous, and then we can all have the rest of our day.
No, thank you, everybody. I mean, this has been quite interesting, I think, for me. After a long time, you know, getting these questions moving in my mind, especially during this time of the pandemic, and noticing that Africa is also struggling. I mean, we are asking to be helped with the vaccines. I mean, they're big questions, and this links to what Karabo said. You know, the moment we began, you mentioned moral, public morality, and there's an expectation that there's an ethical, you know, disposition that sits somewhere across the world. But then we've seen Africa struggling because those who have means, and as Karabo is saying, those who control these institutions want something in return. And it seems like we are struggling with that, even with our own, to secure our own lives now. So thank you so much for this. And thank you for everyone who has attended. Thank you, Professor Mkhize, for stepping in and carrying in quite heavily over the past few series. And thank you for all of us who've been part of this, and we continue to welcome you. The work on Africa is still a long work. There's a long journey to take, and we need to do it. I'm reminded of a question that Professor Okeja asked at the beginning of this series. And the question was, what sort of Africa do we think is worth striving for? And that's an important question till now, because Karabo's observation now just posed a question in that line. You know, what kind of Africa do we think is worth striving for? And this is what this series is trying to do. That's what we're trying to do with our epistemologies as well. And just to close, I will just answer that question with something that Chinua Achebe said. And he said, the freedoms and gains and aspirations that we found for a livable Africa at the onset of the political decolonization. He said those were good, but he reminded us, he also cautioned that we should not think they are guaranteed. They're not secured, they have to be fought for. And that's what we are trying to do with this series. You know, the quality of Africa we want is one that we have to continue fighting for. Thank you so much for joining us in this journey.
Thank you, colleagues. I'd like to thank everybody. Thank our wonderful guest, Prof. Martin Ajei, and thank the organizing team here, Anele, Ngadi, Amy Derived, Dr. Jenny Dupreez, and others, the Emengeni Institute in Massachusetts, Professor Andre Gyekye, the Deputy Vice Chancellor for Engagement and Transformation, who really is working hard to make sure that the Mandela Project is realized in the spirit of who Madiba was. So thank you so much, Professor Gyekye, Professor Okeja, for consistently just making the platform. So I really, Dr. Gyekye, everyone, Karabo, thank you so much. These questions remain important, colleagues. I see the engagement continues there in the chat. All I have to say, Brother Anthony, is so long as the EU is organizing Europeans, Africans have to make a plan for themselves. I have yet to see a convergence between Europeans and Africans that benefits Africans, but that's a discussion for another day. Thank you so much, colleagues, and take a break. There shall be no more Zooms for the rest of the year.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Prof. Gyekye.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, guys. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.